Good evening, everyone. My name is Justin Ellis. For those of you who do not know me or who have not met me, I look forward to hopefully meeting you, obviously, at some point in the near future once we're all allowed to go outside and socialize again. I am the Executive Director of Fuel for Truth. Fuel for Truth is a nonprofit organization that's dedicated to equipping all communities, but specifically we focus on young professionals, the post-college crowd, and equipping them with the knowledge, the tools, and the confidence to have today's ever increasingly difficult conversations about Israel, about Israeli history, about components of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And we do this primarily through our flagship program called Boot Camp. Boot Camp is a multi-week program that we offer in currently 4 cities in New York, Miami, Boston, Los Angeles. This was obviously before COVID. We were obviously operating in all these cities. And during this programming, we go over the major components of Israeli history. We go deep into different components of the conflict to really understand what these things are, how people relate to them, but also very uniquely and very differently than pretty much any other organization I'm aware of, is that this is not just a Hasbara organization, which we teach our participants just to regurgitate what they hear. It's really about how do you take what you are learning, and more importantly, how do you utilize that with emotional intelligence, with best practices of social psychology, and how do you facilitate an engagement and experience with someone so they're going to want to have these conversations with you again and again. And that's irrespective of your political opinions on those issues, and it's irrespective of their political opinions on these issues. So it's a very universal skill that we apply, and it's really what makes this program very special. Both myself and Daniel are alumni of this program. We have a lot of alumni in our audience tonight. We can't say enough about what this program has done for us as certainly as participants, but now both as instructors in the New York class. So obviously, given the current circumstances of COVID-19, we can't be doing in-person programming, so we've shifted online. We concluded a number of boot camps that were ongoing before as this started, but now we're shifting to a series of webinars that we want to take a lot of the programming that we do offer in boot camp and with our other workshops and really be able to offer them to the general public. So not only taking different components of Israeli history, different components of the conflict, but also allowing our leaders, our instructors, and also guest speakers that we bring into class for them to educate you and have discussions with you about the things that matter to them that they want to talk about. And so that's very much what Daniel will be doing tonight, obviously covering challenging assumptions with different forms of language or terms that are obviously available and prevalent in the conflict itself. Before I introduce sort of the webinar and Daniel, I would like to introduce Joey Cohen. Joey is an employee of Jewish National Fund. He is the JNF Future Employee for the Boston region. Fuel for Truth is proud to be partnered with JNF and really supporting all the great work that they are doing, really impacting the people and the land of Israel in a way that no other organization is. And I want to give Joey just a few minutes to talk about the work that JNF is doing and how you can really support Israel and Israelis at a very difficult time and really helping the country and the people that we care about so much.
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Justin, for having me. Big fan of FFT, and I'm glad that JNF and Fuel for Truth can come together for the common goal of just bettering, Israel and the conversation around Israel. We do it in different ways, but we all share sort of the common belief in that we want to better the state of Israel. Like Justin said, I oversee JNF Future in the Boston area, so that means young professionals ages 22 to 40. I do New England too, like for anybody in Vermont or New Hampshire, Connecticut, all that. So I wanted to just do a quick overview of JNF. Many people know us as sort of the tree people. We are still planting trees, but we do a lot more than that, as Justin was alluding to a few minutes ago. We focus on a few different project areas, which are geared toward, revitalizing Israel's north and south, specifically more away from the coast, although we do some work in Haifa, Tel Aviv. But to name a few, we do things like water solutions. We built over 250 reservoirs, allowing Israel to become about 89% running on recycled water. We've built communities one of our most famous ones is in Sderot, with the indoor playground, and of course, they're with rocket fire and everything, as well as medical centers and community centers and employment centers, just to revitalize the inner of Israel, like the Negev and the Galilee. We also preserve a lot of Jewish heritage sites. It is Jewish Heritage Month, technically. We have a few Jewish heritage sites that we preserve, Ammunition Hill to name one of them. I can go deeper into each of these project areas, but my goal is to tell you that we are doing so many different things across Israel, and that there really is sort of something for everyone. And if you're interested in a specific project area, I'm happy to provide deeper information on that. So a couple more things I want to quickly run through. JNF, we are famous for doing a lot of trips to Israel. Obviously, our trips to Israel have been postponed or canceled completely. We do a lot of great missions. I will say that our conference in late October is still on for anybody that signed up for that. We do a lot of different things online, including we're doing virtual tours of Israel throughout our different project areas with real tour guides and live tour guides going through each of the sites to bring people the Israel experience that JNF is so famous for. So I urge people to lastly go on to jnf.org, go to jnf.org/on-demand. There's plenty of amazing sort of virtual speakers, virtual events, virtual tours that are happening every day. They're free. They're very interesting, and you can really learn a lot and really expand and extend your connection to Israel. Lastly, if there's any young professionals out there in the Boston area that want to support Israel, even in this tough time, feel free to reach out, email me. I'll put my email in the chatter, or give me a call. And that's about it. And thank you again. And everybody stay healthy.
Thank you, Joey. Thanks for giving an update about JNF. And yeah, I definitely recommend everyone go to jnf.org to learn more. They offer a lot of interesting on-demand content, including webinars. One tomorrow is actually with former Israeli ambassador to the United States, Michael Oren, talking about the history of Aliyah and certainly the important role that it plays to Israel this day. So to introduce our speaker tonight, or certainly what we're going to be talking about, is conflict language and challenging assumptions. I'm sure all of you know that they're obviously, we all operate based on terminology that we hear from others, that we personally subscribe to. I mean, we develop an entire sort of a dictionary arsenal for ourselves as to how we discuss issues in life. And, this issue about Israel, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is no different. But obviously there are a lot of interesting ways of how people develop an understanding of these terms, and certainly where those come from, and certainly how accurate they are. For instance, an issue like settlements, there is more than one definition of what an Israeli settlement is, depending on the authority you're subscribing to, depending if it's Israel, depending if it's the UN, depending if it's the EU. And also the legality of said settlements is also based on the individual laws or the institution that you're talking about. So when people talk about whether it's, and I'm using settlements just as a quick example, about its legality or illegality, it very much depends on the authority you subscribe to and how you personally feel about that issue. But I'm thankful that Daniel's going to talk about tonight about like what happens when you encounter these terms, or what are some of these terms that are encountered, and then certainly how would you relate to them, how would you talk about them, or certainly what is problematic about their presentation. A big component of Fuel for Truth is we really go on the offense, or we teach our participants in our programs to go on the offense. That rather than playing defense, trying to explain something or trying to redirect someone's attention, instead, really give them the opportunity to actually own their words, to confront that ignorance, or at least to even explain further, certainly in a way that doesn't make them feel threatened, that doesn't make them feel stupid, in a way that actually is going to want to facilitate greater conversation and greater interest in the dialogue that you're having with a person. So thankfully, Daniel is going to be talking about that tonight and a lot of other issues. Daniel Brooks is one of our New York boot camp instructors, has been doing this for a very long time. We're very thankful to have him, and obviously, especially this evening. I think you've heard enough from me, so I will let Daniel take it from here.
Thank you, Justin. Appreciate it. So as Justin said, this is going to be a discussion on language, and it's going to be really rooted in how the media reports Israel-Palestinian issues and the language that the media uses. But this is by no means just simply an examination of the media. These terms really are used generally in discourse about Israel and the conflict. So just a little bit more about how I got involved with Israel activism. It was actually through media bias against Israel. It was 2002, it was the second Intifada. And up until that point, I was in my early 20s. I had been generically pro-Israel. I didn't really know a lot about the conflict, about the first Intifada or about Oslo. I sort of knew some general stuff. But I remember reading online articles about Israel and Israel's supposed overreach and aggression against Palestinians. And I knew something was off about it. So that really launched me into researching more about the issue. And I really haven't stopped since then. So the first thing I did notice was the terms that media used. So as Justin said, we're all familiar with some of these terms that we read in the newspapers, online mostly now. I'm also going to cover some social media or terms that are a little more commonly used in social media. And a bit of a disclaimer, this is not a breakdown on media bias, even though I'm going to share my screen in a second. You're going to see basically articles from mainstream media highlighting the problem with the language that's used. So we're not going to explore issues about without context. We're not going to explore issues about anonymous sources that often media uses when citing Palestinians, or when we see casualty figures that are cited with the operations in Gaza, things like that. We're going to be focusing in on certain terms. So I'm going to share my screen. And these terms I'm really breaking down by category. So the first category is the issue of peace. Now, the issue of peace really is the focal point for media coverage of Israel, because what the media covers is really the mantra, if it bleeds, it leads. So it's really about the absence of peace and what the sides are doing to get peace. So it's interesting to note really how the media covers the two different sides in terms of who wants peace, who doesn't want peace. So this is from an article referencing Israeli peaceniks. Now, we might think we've seen this term so much, Israeli peaceniks or Israel's peace camp, that we've sort of just become immune to the bias behind the term. But generally, if you read through these articles, you'll understand that what the media refers to as peaceniks or peace camp is really the Israeli left, or the labor government in Israel, or now it's down to a few seats, so it's not really much of a government. This next piece is about referencing J Street, as they call it. J Street is a pro-Israel organization that supports a two-state solution. So to support peace in mainstream media, it's really to support a two-state solution. This also suggests that people who are skeptical of the peace process, 25 years of which have proven to be basically a fraud, that Israel has no partner for peace. It basically suggests that those who are skeptical of the peace process or of a two-state solution right now are against the concept of a two-state solution. The LA Times is an example of a common trope of describing how previous negotiations have quote unquote collapsed. And this is a common term. We've been going back to the term, the peace camp. We've heard of, we often hear about Israel's peace camp collapsing. because of sometimes they'll say the Second Intifada. Sometimes they won't even attribute it to anything. They'll just say it's the collapse of the Israeli left. By the way, can you guys, you can't see my screen share? Let me try again.
Hi guys, just wanted to mention one thing while Daniel's just verifying as far as his ability to share his screen, is that going throughout the lesson, obviously if you have any questions related to any of the topics he's covering, any of the content, but also as if it relates to you personally, if you've had any personal experiences that relate to either using this language or hearing this language and not knowing how to respond and you'd like to ask about it, feel free to use the chat for that. But actually, primarily, it'd be much better if you could use the Q&A function, and then toward the end, once we get into discussion and our general Q&A, we can actually address those specifically.
Well, thanks for that. I'm really interested in the back and forth we have with on these issues, because I want to hear. I actually didn't make this as comprehensive as I could have. I wanted to leave some terms kind of off my presentation and leave it open to discussion to talk about things that you've seen, or things on social media that you've come across that arouse your interest. So continuing on the theme of peace, the media often portrays the Israeli side, or at least the Israeli right, which has been in power for a while now, as being quote unquote hardline. So the term hardline is used very often to describe all sorts of politicians from the Israeli right, from Lieberman to Netanyahu, everything in between. And again, I'm focusing really on articles, not opinion pieces. Yet even with articles, the journalist can take some sort of liberties in describing politicians and certain policies. And you can't necessarily say that they are factually inaccurate. So even with articles, the journalist is kind of has free range to offer his opinion or her opinion on certain issues or on certain policies. So the Israeli right, or Netanyahu, is described as hardline. On the Palestinian side, I'm sure we've all heard the term moderate, Fatah. That is basically one of the most common tropes to describe the Palestinian Authority, whose ruling party is Fatah. It's often made easier because since the rise of Hamas in the early 2000s, it's become easier to juxtapose Hamas's more obvious radicalism with the PLO Fatah's less obvious radicalism. Fatah, yes, they do claim credit for attacks against Israelis. They do incite their people through their media to hate Jews and to kill Jews. But at the same time, they often are not as overt as Hamas is. So the term moderate is slapped automatically on the Palestinian side. And again, this is just a very common trope in mainstream media. Regarding that two-state solution, so this is framed very generically in articles about the conflict. It really does come down to the two-state solution. But when the media is covering the issue of Israeli settlements, which is an issue that does not take really breaking news for the media to cover, because in Israel, as I'm sure we've seen, any sort of announcement from any Israeli government body about suspected or proposed plans to build housing in any, at least according to Israel, any uncontroversial areas of Jerusalem, areas within the main settlement blocks, that becomes mainstream news. So this creates this cycle of media coverage that produces the same lines. So for instance, this is a very common line, that settlements in Israel are built on land that the Palestinians, quote unquote, seek for a state. So this is not exactly factually inaccurate in the sense that the Palestinian Authority, or basically the PLO in terms of foreign policy, the PLO is the foreign body that represents the Palestinians, have said officially that they recognize Israel and that they are seeking a state in the West Bank and Gaza. So the media, of course, can report that. That's what the Palestinian Liberation Organization does say. But again, this is something that we just sort of take for granted, or at least mainstream news consumers take for granted, that the Palestinian political power is essentially seeking the West Bank and Gaza for a state. And the facts really would say otherwise. They're not really building long-lasting institutions in these territories for a state at peace with Israel. They're looking essentially to replace Israel, and that's why we have the stalemate. Now we move to international law. So still on the issue of settlements, media covers the issue of Israeli settlements, which again is another, it's sort of itself a loaded term to describe any community that the government of Israel has sanctioned in Judea and Samaria, i.e. the West Bank. So international law is often used in reference to these settlements. Sometimes the media does it in a more fair and balanced way when they say that most of the international community consider settlements illegal, but even that itself is loaded, because we really don't know what the international community is made up of. Is that the UN? Is that the UN General Assembly? Is that Western powers? The media, mainstream media, is a little unclear when they say most of the international community. Again, a very loaded term. Sometimes you'll even see most of the world considers Israeli settlements illegal. This is an example of something a little less fair when they say, in a dramatic break with decades of international law, the US policy has established that settlements are not necessarily illegal. Again, international law is not an easy topic. It's kind of fluid, and there's no really sort of one right answer on some issues. Other issues are a little more clear, but definitely settlements are an issue where there has been, you could say there has been a general consensus. You could say it's based by politics or guided by politics, but there's been a lot of international opinions that have said that Israeli communities over the Green Line in Judea and Samaria are not illegal. And you also don't see any mainstream news covering the Israeli point of view of why Jewish towns and communities in Judea and Samaria is legal, which, as we may know, there is international law going back 100 years. We just celebrated the 100th year anniversary of the San Remo Conference, which codified Jewish settlement anywhere between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. This might seem to some like a sort of an outlier position of the Israeli right, but this is actual international law. Again, it could be open to some interpretation, but that's not a position that you normally see. You pretty much see this generic line about the international consensus. Staying on the issue of law, I'm sure we're very familiar with the term 67 borders. Now, 67 borders refers to the ceasefire lines from the 1948 war. It was technically 1949 when Israel signed ceasefire agreements with Jordan to basically demarcate where their own armies were standing, which is now on basically what the lines were of now the West Bank and Israel. And they signed the same agreements with Egypt on what's basically the line separating Israel proper from Gaza. The reason why these lines are not borders is because borders connotes that they are recognized in international law as lines separating one state from another state. So even though borders can sort of speak to a shorthand describing, ceasefire lines as a few extra syllables, it's a little more complex, I suppose, to write ceasefire lines in an article. The term 67 borders is used so commonly, you never see any alternative to that. And again, 67 borders connotes that this is something that's recognized, that the line separating Israel from what's considered the West Bank is sacrosanct and is so officially recognized that Israel building any Jewish communities beyond these ceasefire lines sort of comes across as illegitimate, especially if you use the word borders. When a nation crosses a border and builds across a border, it connotes something that's illegitimate. So that doesn't mean that every time the word borders is used, it's necessarily looking to indict Israel, but that is definitely the result of that. It's a graphic from a Reuters article that speaks to the Gaza Strip. And now we're on to the Gaza Strip, where this is also a very hot topic in the media. There are visuals that are coming out of Gaza that really paint Israel as a quote unquote jailer of 2 million Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip. So on a visual level, and we know that visuals really sell in the media, this is a common issue that's brought up. So the term that's used here on this little graphic from Reuters speaks to the blockade that Israel has had in place since 2007. And as we know, Hamas won elections in 2006 after Israel pulled out a year earlier from the territory. It tore up all its communities, left completely. And the borders after Israel pulled out were actually open, essentially. I mean, the Erez crossing was open for trade, open for commerce. It was only after Hamas started shooting rockets and mortars, not only into Israel, but at the border itself, that Israel put the blockade in place, which is from 2007. So that is a lot of context to provide in articles. But here we see a loaded term called isolated. The blockade has isolated Gaza from the rest of the world, which, again, it's open to the interpretation of the journalist writing this. I guess he's free to say the word isolated, but it's a very loaded term, and it's a bit of a stretch to say that Gaza is isolated, where you do have the Erez crossing and other crossings essentially operating fully, except that Israel does check all the products coming into Gaza. However, Israel does export and import products into and out of Gaza. So it's not exactly isolated. People are free to leave Gaza. In fact, they're more limited from leaving Gaza from Hamas than they are from Israel. In Gaza, we've had what's called protests at the border. The first, most prominent protests were the Great Return March protests from about 2 years ago, April 2018, where ostensibly you had Gazans who were demanding their right to return to Israel. In doing so, they were going to the ceasefire lines, I guess what's called the border with Israel, where there is a fence separating Israel proper from Gaza. And there was a civilian presence at some of these quote unquote protests. There were picnics, there were other things that attracted families and children, but they were not right at the border, or the ceasefire line. At the border were actual Hamas terrorists who were trying to break through and enter Israel to kill Israelis or take them hostage, as Hamas itself admitted. But throughout the media, you had this operation depicted as a protest, and you had those killed at the border who Hamas itself admitted were mostly its own terrorists. You had them depicted as protesters. This was one of the most common depictions in mainstream media. And this is something that really has a sort of a zing effect. This is this really appeals to the average person who doesn't know what's going on. When they see that protesters are killed, this is something that's not seen every day. And this brings to mind, for Americans, a lot of issues like Kent State University. We just celebrated the 50th anniversary of college protesters at Kent State in Ohio getting shot by National Guardsmen. So this is something that appeals, or that really resonates with people who are mortified that any protester would be killed. Another trope coming out of the media coverage of Gaza is that statistics on deaths and other issues are reported to the mainstream press from Gaza's health ministry. Now, it sounds innocuous enough, but Gaza's health ministry is really run by Hamas, the terrorist organization, which is something that's not covered or not detailed in the articles that cite this ministry. Now, moving on to the category of history. Most articles that do cover older history relating to this conflict really speak about the 1948 war. And the most common line we see refers to Palestinian refugees, and which is what is really centered as the main issue of why there's this war. It sort of kind of flips cause and effect. But a common line that we see is that 750,000 Palestinians fled or were expelled from or during the 1948 war surrounding Israel's creation. Now, that itself is not a lie, but it's kind of shielding something. Another line we see is Palestinian uprooting was during the 1948 war over Israel's creation. The fact that it sort of suggests that there was Palestinian flight, the fleeing of Palestinians en masse from this war, the suggestion that this was really based on Israel's creation suggests that Israel's creation necessitated Palestinians leaving their homes. And so this isn't really stated clearly here, but it's something that's sort of implied, that it wasn't really the war against Israel. Here it's at least said war over Israel, but it wasn't the war against Israel. They're kind of suggesting that it was really Israel's creation that's the cause of this. And often we will see lines saying, not even talking about a war. They'll just say that upon Israel's founding, 750,000 Palestinians fled or were expelled, which again makes it seem like Israel itself was the problem. BDS has become much more prominent in the last 10 years, especially in the last few years, and with their provocative protests, and then basically they've inserted themselves in the news. A lot of coverage about BDS has really missed the ball on what BDS is about, because BDS, as we know, stands for Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions. And while BDS, at least on its website and published materials, speaks about pressuring Israel to comply with international law, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's actually what it's doing. Because as we've learned in Fuel for Truth, BDS's demands are not connected to international law. They're connected to a very distorted, biased version of international law that's not related to the truth. So, I guess the journalist is in a bit of a position here where they're not going to go into a whole dissertation on international law, but at the same time, they could at least put quote marks around what BDS wants. Instead, as this Chicago Tribune article is stating, they're kind of treating it very matter-of-factly, very self-evidently, that BDS is really about forcing Israel to comply with international law with the Palestinians. It gets even worse. There's a USA Today article that covered BDS and referenced the word critic three times in one small paragraph. If you look at the bottom, critics said that the critics of BDS say that this is the executive order that Trump passed last year to protect Jewish college students from anti-Zionism. So basically, critics said that the order is really targeting criticism of Israel, particularly BDS. And just to reaffirm, the journalist says BDS involves criticism of Israeli policies, which sounds pretty rational. It sounds like BDS is just really criticizing Israeli policies, that it's not against the state of Israel itself. And as we know, BDS is against Zionism, it's against the state of Israel. It does not state this, at least officially, very clearly, because it's hoping for coverage like this. It's hoping to present itself as a rational movement. There was one more line, but it's not in the, I'll stop sharing. To also sanitize BDS, often media coverage will really present its critics as being critical of only one major point, that critics allege, and this is, I'm quoting most media when they talk about BDS, critics allege that BDS is anti-Semitic, not because BDS looks to destroy Israel, or that BDS misinterprets international law to defame Israel, but that BDS applies a double standard to Israel. Now, some of us might agree that that's what makes BDS anti-Semitic, but saying that BDS applies a double standard to Israel is almost like saying that Israel, it might be guilty of some of the things they're doing, but how come BDS doesn't focus on other regimes around the world? It doesn't focus on China. It doesn't focus on Saudi Arabia. So that to me is not putting forward the best argument from critics of BDS. And I think there's something intentional there. It's looking sort of to take this, an argument that really wouldn't appeal to most news consumers, that critics just say it's anti-Semitic because they're singling out Israel. But then again, BDS is, as it's framed in these articles, from Palestinian quote unquote civil society, which is untrue. It's really born from the Arab League. Now we're going to shift to social media, and I want to open this up to more topics, to more comments from you guys. Social media really is putting out, and there are no rules obviously with social media, there's no filters. The term Palestinian rights is one of the most commonly heard terms today. It's even become a little more mainstream with regular media. But I want to hear from you, whether you have questions you want to present verbally or just through the chat room. When I bring up Palestinian rights, does anybody have any thoughts on what that means? I mean, because sometimes it's presented as generic, like we think of rights for people, we think of basic human rights, right? The right to life, the right to liberty, the right not to be threatened or killed, the right to citizenship. But the Palestinian Solidarity Movement has a very specific set of demands when they refer to advocating for Palestinian rights. So if anyone could just type in what is really meant when Palestinian solidarity activists refer to Palestinian rights. I'll go on. If anybody wants to comment, go ahead. But this is a term that's often used also with media. When they refer to BDS, they talk about Palestinian rights advocates or activists. Just to round out social media issues, Palestinian resistance is also a term that's often used. And resistance is something that comes across as very noble. When I was growing up, when I heard like resistance, I thought of Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. I thought of, resistance against the Nazis throughout World War II in different areas. Palestinian resistance is very commonly used in social media in two different ways. One way is to justify actual terrorism by Hamas or Fatah or Islamic Jihad. They won't go ahead and call it nonviolent resistance. They'll just say this is Palestinians resisting occupation. Resistance also is sometimes called, inaccurately, it's sometimes called nonviolent by the anti-Israel activists. Nonviolent resistance actually refers to violent riots that are conducted by Palestinians against Israelis. It's mostly in the territories, mostly in Judea, Samaria, where there are often organized mobs who are preventing or obstructing Israeli operations. Sometimes they go into closed military zones. Some of us might have seen recently the trend of, we've seen this in Susia, in the Hebron Hills in Judea, where you have international activists as well as Palestinians looking to set up makeshift tents and makeshift homes in areas that are really closed to development or that they did not seek a permit for. And this is also what's deemed to be resistance. But again, even resistance where you're not carrying a gun or a missile, it can still be violent. And often these demonstrations are. And then finally, I want to end on a term or on this really distorted framing and a trap question, sort of citing If Not Now and Jewish Voice for Peace and other groups that call themselves anti-occupation. So we all have heard the term occupation ad nauseum, but now the term occupation is being weaponized in a way where people are being asked to decide what side of the conflict are they on and what side of morality are they on. So If Not Now will often accuse the Jewish establishment of being pro-occupation, essentially of providing cover for Israel's what they call 50 plus years of occupation of Palestinian territories. And meanwhile, they present themselves, If Not Now and Jewish Voice for Peace, as being anti-occupation. And even the media will sometimes parrot their self-description. They'll say, If Not Now is a group of anti-occupation activists. So this, again, it's a trap question, but these are the terminologies that are used really to set people up, those who do not agree with these activist organizations. I just want to read some of these questions that I have. So yeah, Mike says, the 1967 war is misunderstood. I never hear that Israel has only fought defensive wars. Now the world wants Israel to give back land it wanted defensive wars. Yeah, I mean, that's definitely something that you might read in opinion pieces or that should be in opinion pieces. But yeah, there's definitely something lacking in article writing. You don't really see defensive war referenced. Sometimes you will see references to when the occupation of Judea Samaria started. And that is sometimes very antiseptically referenced as, in 1967, Israel occupied the West Bank, without even mentioning that there was a war launched against Israel. So yes, to your point, it is misunderstood. You also asked, do suicide bombers still receive a salary? I don't have up to the minute information on that, but I'm going to go on a limb and say that they are. But yeah, that's something that's also not covered in the media. Whenever there are suicide attacks, and even the term suicide bomber has become somewhat antiquated, that when there's media coverage of Israel building the West Bank barrier, the separation barrier, it's often cited as it was in response to the suicide bombings of the Second Intifada. And sometimes I've seen media even saying that suicide bombings have been a very rare occurrence recently, because often suicide bombing, quote unquote, is really a term to connote an actual a terrorist detonating a bomb on their body on a bus or in a cafe in Israel. But that also conceals that a lot of attacks against Israel, number one, are thwarted by the IDF, which that is why they maintain a presence in Judea and Samaria. But number two, a lot of suicide attacks by the Palestinians today do not involve explosives. Some of them still do, but a lot of them are a little more pedestrian. So there are stabbing attacks that are encouraged. Palestinians shoot at Israelis nearby with sniper rifles. A couple of years ago, we heard about ramming attacks against Israelis. So those are also, in a sense, suicide attacks, because the person attacking Israeli Jews pretty much knows that they're either going to be shot in the process or, basically seriously wounded in the process of attacking Israelis, or they're going right to prison. But more often than not, they do actually go to prison, but it is essentially a suicide attack. So I want to open it up. Does anybody have any comments about what I presented? Does anybody have any thoughts on their own experience with media bias, or at least terminology that they think is a little off when it comes to Israel?
So Daniel, we actually do have some people who wrote in the Q&A box.
Got it. Yep.
I'm not sure in terms of when exactly this was reaction to, but we can kind of play off of it. First one relates to freedom of movement as well as rights to property.
Sure. So freedom of movement is a term that's often used to describe Palestinian movement in the West Bank, from town to town. It is a term that's breezily used from mainstream media and also activists on social media to really describe Palestinians having to confront checkpoints, roadblocks, which are much less common than they used to be during the Second Intifada. So that's a loaded term. I mean, freedom of movement is also something that would appeal to somebody anywhere who really values basically being able to go anywhere they want at any time. But what's often not described along with that term is that these restrictions are in place to prevent terrorist attacks. Most Palestinian movement is not restricted. So there is often this very unfair depiction of Palestinian life in general as being subjected to the whims of Israeli soldiers, which is really a very small minority of situations. And rights to property, I personally don't remember seeing that exact term used often, but it might have something to do with Israelis in Judea Samaria claiming certain land that Palestinians feel is theirs. I know that's also a loaded issue as depicted in the media, because there are legal disputes and there are Palestinians who are in properties that have been purchased by Jewish agencies or Jewish individuals. So you have these very heart-rending scenes of Palestinians being evicted from homes, but that is also more of a legal issue. Definitely the next one is about right to have their own nation state. And again, the term right is also very loaded and it's really a very universal thing. And that is something that I would see more on social media. The only thing I would say in response is that, rights do exist for individuals in terms of nation states. Rights are at least conditional on behavior of governing entities. So when I've responded to people that say that if Israel has a right to exist, how come Palestine doesn't have a right to exist? And I would say, well, that has to do with the war that the Palestinian government is declaring against, or is waging against Israel. So kind of subsumed to that. That's, Jonathan Sanker brings up a great point. The right to vote, the implication that Israel is withholding it as opposed to the Palestinian Authority that's governing the Palestinians. So we've heard it often that the Palestinians have not been able to vote since, I think it's been, 2004, 2005. And that's true. And that's also this false framing that this is also in a lot of commentary about Israel, that Israel is really asked to choose. Like basically the not accusation, but the directive towards Israel is either you should end the occupation or you should give Palestinians in the West Bank the right to vote in Israeli elections, or also you should just give them citizenship, which is kind of a false framing because it overlooks the fact that Palestinians live in their own society. They're governed by the Palestinian Authority. They don't really want to be Israeli citizens. And so it's almost like a very overly Israeli-centric viewpoint that Israel is really the only society with it between the river and the sea, which is not true. You have a Palestinian society there that is very homogenous, that doesn't want to mix with Israel. This is also something that's very rarely brought up. So yeah, that's a good point. It's a false framing that the issue is really not the right to vote for Palestinians. The last comment is, when was the term occupation first used, and why did we let that go unchecked? I think the term occupation was initially used before what we consider the occupation started, which is 1967. Israel applied a military occupation by law to the West Bank. So as I'm sure we know, occupation has a double meaning. There are anti-Israel activists who use the term occupation to describe Israel generally, like all of Israel. And then some use it to describe just Israel's control of the West Bank and Gaza. And sometimes they use it interchangeably. But yeah, I believe that I've seen speeches and other coverage of Arab states and others who are advocating against Israel using the term occupation to describe Israel as early as the 50s. But I think it was just after the 67 war that it became a little more prominent to describe Israel's control as an occupation.
And also here, Daniel, just to piggyback off your point off of that, when it comes to a lot of these terms that we hear, whether it's, as Daniel has mentioned, in the media or certainly in personal discourse, a lot of time, we are reacting obviously based on our understanding of this term, both as far as a dictionary definition as well as its application, but so is the other person we're talking to. So one thing that frequently happens is that two people are using the same term to describe two very different things. They think the person they're speaking to is meaning the same thing as them and vice versa. And what was going to be a civil conversation breaks down very easily because both parties are frustrated that they're effectively having two different conversations with the same person. So one of the things that we obviously really teach, and obviously this is kind of a foundation of, Fuel for Truth and our programming, is really making sure that you clarify that terminology ahead of time with people. It will save you and them a lot of stress, a lot of pain, and you will have far more civil conversations about whatever the issue is as a result.
Great. And even if you're not super confident in your knowledge on, let's say, BDS or the occupation or refugees, just asking the question is definitely more productive than just saying, oh, you're full of shit, or I don't agree, or because again, a lot of people who are detractors of Israel don't really expect to engage in a conversation. A lot of it is really just getting out talking points. Not to say that they don't feel they're coming from a moral position, but it's not necessarily, they're not looking to engage in dialogue. So are Palestinians really Jordanians? It's an interesting question. I guess you could also say, what's a Jordanian? Because, as we know, the nation of Jordan is somewhat artificial. Is really carved out of what's today Saudi Arabia, or at least Arabia. I guess you can say that because a large majority of Jordanians, I believe it's 70%, are Palestinian Arabs, I guess that is not an irrational designation for Palestinians. At the same time, it depends what the context is. I've heard some pro-Israel people say, like, calling Palestinians displaced Jordanians, which I understand the history behind that term, but I don't know in terms of how productive that is in the conversation you're having. But it is an interesting point. And when we're looking at maps of like Israel and the West Bank, and sometimes you see these maps regarding certain solutions, like the Trump plan came out recently, and we saw these maps. A lot of people are taken in by the fact that the Palestinian state that's being proposed is really small. And I guess if you compare it next to like what Israel is today, Israel proper, it is smaller than Israel. I mean, it's basically 22% of the territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. But a lot of pro-Israel activists, or some pro-Israel activists, and I tend to agree, say, look, if you include Jordan, or at least parts of Western Jordan, that percentage that the Arabs have is actually a lot bigger. And considering that most Jordanians are already Palestinian Arabs, the map of between river and sea is a little skewed. If you open it up and broaden it out, who's to say that the Jordanian government cannot control certain areas of the West Bank? So I think there needs to be some creative ideas for solutions in giving Arabs living in Judea, Samaria more rights, more freedoms of movement, things like that. So that's an interesting point about Jordan. Has anybody had any experience on social media? Anybody follow like If Not Now or Jewish Voice for Peace or any anti-Israel activists? Not sure why anybody would necessarily want to, but it's always good to keep tabs. Justin, do you follow anti-Israel media?
I mean, I guess it would depend how you define anti-Israel. Do I follow sources that have anything, but kind things to say about Israel or Israeli policy or Israelis? Sure. Sometimes I do it, really, just to broaden my perspective or really to understand like what people are saying, or certainly why they believe what they are saying to be true, certainly what that's rooted in their understanding of reality. Some of it is, like on social media, I'm there for the comments. So it kind of depends on, the source and the purpose. But, I would recommend for everyone, to obviously broaden your horizon as much as possible, especially by reading things that you inherently don't agree with or that may upset you or you might find emotionally troubling. This will broaden your understanding of the issues as a whole. And also just to appreciate, you can actually find deeper bits of truth in the criticisms of what people are laying either at you individually or Israel, obviously as an entity or as our nation state. Just because someone has something not so nice to say doesn't mean there isn't any truth in it. It's really for you to understand, like, where's that truth coming from? Where's that sentiment rooted in their understanding? And also for you to appreciate, like, how may this actually be true? Based on, either my individual behavior or Israel's behavior, is this potentially true? And as supporters of Israel, those who obviously want Israel to be at its best, therefore, what can we do to be better? And that's a real way of, obviously looking inward to become better and to lift ourselves up, as opposed to what a lot of organizations or individuals do and really, kind of just complaining, criticizing, and then doing nothing with it, or just as a means of tearing it down.
I think it's always good to expose yourself to other perspectives, whether you agree or not, whether you're offended by them or not. I'm offended by a lot of the people I follow on Twitter, but it's always a net gain whenever I see this language used. It always makes me think a little more. And yeah, there's some complexity behind it. At the same time, it's really sharpened my ability to have these conversations with people. I've had in-person conversations and I've had conversations on the internet with people, and I'm able to navigate them better because I kind of know what they're referring to with some of the language that they've used in the past. So yeah, I think it's always beneficial to expose yourself to this different language.
Couldn't agree more. Any other questions as far as what we've covered tonight, or certainly just anything in general, any based on Israel conversations that you are currently having or previously have? Obviously can be related to as far as challenging assumptions or terminology and language, but could also be broader, as we kind of wrap things up this evening.
And is there anything you'd like to see us cover going forward?
Yes, that would also be helpful to know. We aim to please.
No, they're so captivated. They're still taking it in.
Exactly. Okay, if that's the case, thank you, Daniel, so much for offering the webinar this evening, really kind of sharing your experience in terms of understanding the terminology that's used. Obviously, even as you were going over it, for me personally, I was seeing more and more frequently, I've seen these terms used in the same structure over and over again repeatedly, typically either by the same authors or the same media sources. But it's interesting how very much this is often kind of copy pasted as a template, as just sort of a general background of this issue without actually thinking too deeply about what does this actually mean? Where is this potentially true? Where is this potentially false? Or at least without, the qualification of describing it, of expanding upon it, and, certainly clarifying it, contextualizing it, a lot is going to get lost, and a lot of people are not going to understand this in a more deep way, irrespective of their own politics. But yeah, thank you again for doing this webinar for us tonight. We do have a webinar tomorrow night with Leon Anjar, who is one of our Miami bootcamp instructors. He's also a medical doctor, so very thankful for him taking the time out of saving lives during this crisis to spend some time with us. And he'll be going over the perception of Israelis and, more specifically, how someone's understanding of who or what a Jew is influences their understanding of what Israel or who Israelis are, whether, from a very Ashkenazic perspective, a very Sephardic perspective, but certainly how people's backgrounds and their understanding about Jews influence their understanding of Israel. For all the other webinars we're doing, you can find a complete updated list on our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/fuelfortruth. On the events tab, you can see everything that we're doing. We'll also be sending out emails regularly updating you as well. But thank you guys for attending this evening. And if you have any questions about Fuel for Truth, about the programming, about webinars that we do, please feel free to reach out at info@fuelfortruth.org, and we'd be happy to discuss with you.
Justin, that was a great closing. I just wanted to say I missed a couple of comments towards the end. I don't know if we have a chance to get to them. There are 3 of them.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, cool. So anonymous attendee, it could be a plant. Is leadership of Hamas and the PLO the impediment to peace versus the general population? That's a great nuanced point, and that's not an easy answer. So when I sometimes tweet back at anti-Israel activists, I do make it more about the politics and not the people. Although there's a lot to be said about Palestinian society, even though most Palestinians are not active terrorists, some of them do support Fatah and Hamas's war against Israel. So I would be careful about indicting, Palestinian society, or the general population, as you term it. I would keep it on the politics and say that there is support among some of the population for those policies, but I tend to say, like most people, most Palestinians, do actually want, normalcy. They want normal lives. And it depends on the conversation you're in. If you're in a conversation about Palestinian society in general, then you could sort of, that there is criticism to be leveled there. Next question is from John Senker. How could we or should we point to the nefarious Soviet influence in narrowing the conflict such that people ignore the rest of Palestine, like Jordan, and making Israel the Goliath as opposed to the David? That's not easy also, but it is an interesting point to talk about how the PLO and the Soviets did work together in the early 60s to sort of repackage and remarket the conflict on the international stage. So I would be careful about saying, because a lot of people, when they bring up Palestine, issues about Palestine, they really speak to rights and individual Palestinians and things affecting them. So bringing up like a Soviet propaganda plan could almost seem like tone deaf if someone's talking to you about the livelihoods of actual Palestinians. So I would navigate that a little carefully. I would address one first and then the other separately. So I would say, like, yes, it sucks. Arab Palestinians have to deal with their bad political, the bad political decisions of their leaders. And then I would point to say, and also the notion of, you know, a Palestinian or a Palestine that goes back decades or centuries was really more invented by propaganda. And then I would sort of drill down from there. Last question is, what are one or two assumptions on the pro-Israel end we make that are incorrect?
Love that question.
Love that question. I guess one is that you could say this is an assumption that when people often say that Palestine did not exist throughout history, and that that Jews have been there for thousands of years, which is true, and both comments are true. That often is in response to someone talking about the hardships or that Palestinians have faced, and specifically what happened to our Palestinian Arabs in 1948 and beyond. So I think those points can be made about there never was a Palestine. At the same time, I wouldn't necessarily use them as a catch-all response when people talk about, you know, Palestinian plight in the 1940s or things like that. I would get into the details of why that happened. I would give it context. But I think we too often throw around these terms like there was never a Palestine, which again, I think has value in saying that, but I wouldn't use it as a catch-all. Justin, do you have anything to add about pro-Israel assumptions?
Yeah, you know, I think one thing that can really be added to that is that most people, you know, based on, you know, what you would call a narrative, you know, and obviously narratives, there are different narratives on, you know, sort of different sort of hierarchical levels. Obviously, we have personal narratives, we have familial narratives, societal, national narratives. I think one of them that kind of fits into this is that the way we see ourselves in our own story as sort of the main character, the hero, we tend to kind of like superimpose like what our understanding is of the other, the villain, onto them, as opposed to actually how they see themselves. And I think that's something that we do to Palestinians. I think it's something that Palestinians do to us. And therefore, the sort of persona that we're interacting with or believe that we are interacting with isn't the actual person or the actual entity that we're dealing with. And therefore, like I mentioned before, if each has a different understanding of a term, but you're using the same term in the same conversation, it's like having two different conversations. And therefore, if you're not actually relating to a person as they see themselves, you're not actually understanding who you're dealing with. We do that to Palestinians. Palestinians do that to us. So one thing I would honestly stress to all of you, if you have the opportunity to talk to Arabs, if you have the opportunity to talk to Muslims, to Palestinians in particular, you know, actually ask them about themselves. How do they see themselves? Why do they see the world the way they do? More times than not, they are actually going to give you an honest answer that's really going to be more informative of how you understand the situation from their perspective and how you can actually approach it.
Great. That covers all the questions.
I think so.
Anonymous attendee to ask for more info on settlements, but we don't have 5 hours. But if they're interested in emailing us, either Justin or me, I'd be happy to talk about that.
Happily. Yeah. So any follow-up questions to this material or anything that you'd like to discuss, please email us at info@fuelfortruth.org. Please, coming back to the seminars, these webinars we should be doing on a weekly basis. Soon we will actually be introducing a lot more of the bootcamp curriculum, which does include settlements in it. So there will be an opportunity to have a webinar about that subject in particular. But thank you guys again for attending this evening. Thank you, Daniel, for taking the time to do this with everyone. And we look forward to the next one.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.